All right, Brandon Ingram has been traded to the Toronto Raptors. Was it a good return for the Pelicans, a bad return? We'll also look at BI's time here in New Orleans, put some proper context around it. Oh yeah, the Pelicans made another trade as well today. So it's a live reaction show here on Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcast and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, here with y'all on this Wednesday night for the Thursday show here. We are doing a live show because Brandon Ingram was just traded to the Toronto Raptors. This broke just a moment or two ago. We'll break down the return that the Pelicans got. Good deal, bad deal, how it ended up in this situation in the first place. I want to put a little bit of context around the Brandon Ingram trade, his time here in New Orleans as well. And then we'll look at the other deal the Pelicans made and where they go from here. So, of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans here. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. So before we get into the trade here, a couple of just quick housekeeping notes for the live shows that we do. I'm going to do my whole show. It's just 3 segments. We're going to run through it. Then we do a bonus 4th segment where I'll interact with y'all at the end. So give it about 25 minutes and I'll get to the chat here. Please do not spam the chat. It's easier for me to just kind of like block you from it than that's how I've got to moderate it. It's just that easy. So that's what we're looking at here. There's also going to be a couple of pieces of information that I'm still missing. I don't know if we've seen the draft pick that's coming back to New Orleans, exactly which one that it is here. So those are things to kind of keep in mind as well here. So let's get into it here on Locked On Pelicans. By the way, give me your trade grade in the comments down below. So the deal that I see right now, and I'm literally doing this live here, it's going to be Bruce Brown Jr., Kelly Olynyk, and multiple draft picks coming back to the New Orleans Pelicans. I think I'm still waiting on what those exact draft picks are, but from what I got texted, it's a 1st and 2nd round pick at the very least, and we'll figure out the specifics of what those what the picks are. So this is a move that we kind of expected, right? We knew Brandon Ingram was going to get traded by this team here, and so it's not a big shock that it went like this. Getting a 1st round pick, getting a 2nd round pick, getting expiring salary, that's kind of what they were looking for here. It was going to be some combination of that, but this was not going to be a tremendous haul for the New Orleans Pelicans, a la the Anthony Davis trade or some other deals that we've expected. Given the circumstances as of today, and more on this in the next segment here, this was about as good as New Orleans probably was going to be able to do. And if you listened to the show yesterday, the Everydayers heard this. A lot of y'all heard this. It was well listened to. When we looked at Toronto, I said, no way are they going to bring RJ Barrett back. You had to, in this deal, factor in the Pelicans salary cap next year. So they were going to look for expiring salary, and if they carried any money over, it was going to be in a smaller range. Thus, you get Bruce Brown Jr., who's on a $23 million expiring deal, and then Kelly Olynyk, who's going to make next year $13.445 million. That fits in the Pelicans' room to the luxury tax that they have. Right now, if you would just let everyone kind of walk off the books with Trey Murphy's extension kicking in, which adds $20 million to the books next year, you can fit in that $13.5 million from Kelly Olynyk because gives the Pelicans then about $8-9 million to the luxury tax threshold to fill out the rest of the roster. So this fits in the financial constraints that New Orleans was probably kind of had over their head when it comes to this deal. That's why they didn't get an RJ Barrett back. That's what I told you in yesterday's show. Specifically mentioned they weren't going to take back RJ Barrett in this. This deal was also complicated by the fact that Brandon Ingram is due for a lot of money, right? And so you look at that and you realize it was just always going to be a divorce. There's a couple of things with this deal that, kind of made sense that this was going to end up happening. And as I said just a moment ago, all things considered, I think the Pelicans did about as good of a job as they could getting a first-round pick back. I see a lot of y'all saying it's a Pacers 2026 first-round pick that is 1 to 4 protected. That's fine. Look, it's not that pick's going to be likely in the early 20s, early to mid 20s. Getting a first-round draft pick for him that you can use to try and improve the roster later or for whatever you might want to do, I think ends up being a pretty good deal here. Olynyk's likely going to be moved with that pick in some capacity in the future. By doing this deal, the Pelicans fix their financial books and keep things okay for next year. It's not an amazing deal. The only way you would have gotten an amazing deal was maybe 2 years ago on Brandon Ingram or even last year when there was a very real market for him. And more on that in the second and third segment here when we look at a lot of the mistakes that this front office has made with this sort of situation here. But overall, they getting a first round pick back that's like a usable first round pick. If you look at the return for De'Aaron Fox in Sacramento, 3 first-round picks. That's more than they got for Luka, right? One of those is literally going to turn into 2 second-round picks, and that's not really a great thing. We don't know what this second-round pick that they're getting back is either, but that's a very useful thing to get too. So this trade for New Orleans is not really about the players. It's about the salary cap flexibility and the draft picks, right? They're out of contention this season. They're not making the playoffs at all this season. Bruce Brown Jr., who's expiring, doesn't really matter. Kelly Olynyk doesn't matter whatsoever here. So that, to me, says, okay, who really cares about the players? It's about the picks. I will say this helps New Orleans in future trades. When you look at players that are on the roster next season that are making, say, $15-ish million, somewhere in that range, it's literally just Herb Jones and now Olynyk. So that's a really useful type of salary to have to try and trade someone out. If you wanted to get a $20 million player for your $13.5 million player, New Orleans can make this work now, and they couldn't do that before. So it's not a great return for Brandon Ingram in terms of basketball playing talent, but it is a good enough return. Again, given the circumstances, and that's important here, for the flexibility here. And when you look at this deal, this is better than losing Brandon Ingram for nothing, in my opinion. Olynyk next year doesn't kill your books whatsoever, and I think that's a really important thing, that is someone that doesn't put them in a bad position. If you had traded for RJ Barrett, along with, say, Chris Boucher or someone expiring, then all of a sudden, you would have been over the luxury tax already, and we would have been doing this dance leading up to the trade deadline ahead of time to try and duck the luxury tax. So that's where I think this ends up being a fine deal for the New Orleans Pelicans here. So there you go. There's a flip side of this too, as well, of you just made the Toronto Raptors better. This is a team that I get this from their perspective and I don't. This is a team that could have been competing, right, for a top draft pick. Now you kind of take them out of that equation depending on when Brandon Ingram returns. So this helps the New Orleans Pelicans tank. It hurts another team's tank. It gives you financial flexibility. When you kind of put that up and look at it as of today at 11:08 p.m. on Wednesday, February 5th, it's been 2 days, y'all. That's as good of a deal and a situation as you're going to find. Is that as good of a trade as you would have gotten a year ago? Absolutely not. 2 years ago? Absolutely not. And I want to acknowledge that here. But given the circumstances right now, about as good as you could really have hoped for in a position like this. So let's look at a couple more pieces from this trade. We're going to be a little bit looser with the structure of the show today because we're kind of writing. I have like 2 notes and that's about it here. So coming up next, I want to look at, could these players be rerouted? Are there more moves to make? The trade deadline is not till 2 p.m. Central tomorrow. We'll also look at the Daniel Theis salary dump and kind of where the Pelicans go from here. And I want to put some more context around Brandon Ingram and his time here in New Orleans, because it does end in kind of a negative way, but I think his time here was, in a sense, positive too. It's a mixed bag. Let's talk about that coming up here next, and then we'll do the bonus part where I interact with the chat, take your questions, all of that. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Prize Picks. Basketball season is heating up, seriously. And there's no better way to get in on the action than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. And with over 11 million members and billions awarded in winning, Prize Picks makes it easy and fun to turn your sports knowledge into real money. So here's how it works. Just pick more or less on at least 2 player projections. And if you're right, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. Prize Picks even has a free pick for the big game where Patrick Mahomes only needs to throw 1 yard to win. Pair that with one more correct pick and you're cashing out. Luka Doncic, anytime he's playing the Mavs going forward, I am taking taking more on assists, points, everything. Prize Picks lets you set your lineups in less than 60 seconds, and they have fast, secure withdrawals, which means you get paid quickly when you win. So check out the promo tabs too for all of the different bonuses they have going on. So download the app today. Use code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNBA for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans. Let me know when here's the question we get the live chat. When did you start listening to Locked On Pelicans? Is it literally tonight? Have you been with me a couple of years? Did you discover it this offseason? What is it? Let me know in the comments down below and give me the grade that you have for this Brandon Ingram deal. So let's knock out a couple of things here that are important. Oh, by the way, before I do that, don't forget the free Locked On Pelicans daily newsletter. It's right down there in the corner. You can sign up over at lockedondaily.com. Get Locked On Pelicans in your inbox Monday through Friday here. And there's also really great coverage around the league as well. So we're going to do this segment, the next segment, then we're going to interact with the chat. I'll hang out with y'all for a real long time out here if you want, so we can make sense of this trade too. I have a lot more that I want to talk about these trades. It'll probably be in tomorrow's show as well. So that's the Friday show. So there's going to be a lot of talks here about all of that. So let's get into more of this trade. In theory, Bruce Brown or Kelly Olynyk could be rerouted. I don't know if they plan to. I would imagine, this is not sourced or anything like that. I would imagine that Bruce Brown is not going to get rerouted in any sense. I think that he is going to stay here. They're just going to let him expire, and that's going to be that, and maybe work with him in the offseason or something like that. They don't want that salary on the books whatsoever. They need to get it off. If you didn't listen to it, go listen to yesterday's show when I talked about a Brandon Ingram trade being blocked. And that was because if they were going to take on an RJ Barrett or something like that, they needed to figure out a couple of things with their salary cap for next season. Not this season, but next season. This trade does fix that. Kelly Olynyk, I think, is someone that could get rerouted. I don't know if he really will. I can't imagine he has a very big trade market. I don't know what you'd be trying to go and get, but there you go. So I think he could be rerouted, but I'm not expecting that. If the Pelicans could get more assets for him, I think they definitely would. And that's kind of it. So they might not be done dealing here. Just as when they made that move to dump Daniel Theis, duck under the luxury tax, for sure with that deal, they weren't necessarily done. By the way, this trade does save them about $200,000 against the luxury tax, not the salary cap, but the luxury tax this year. They were already under it. This does it as well. We'll talk more about that in the next segment because that does have a pretty significant implication on Brandon Boston Jr. So let's look at Brandon Ingram's time here. How would you rate it? grade it? What would you say if you're kind of doing like a eulogy in a sense about Brandon Ingram's time here in New Orleans? And I think it's been interesting to say the very least. He's obviously a very talented basketball player that's led New Orleans through, not that this is like a high bar to clear, one of the better eras that they've ever had. They made the playoffs twice during his time here in New Orleans. He won Most Improved Player his first year. He was an All-Star his first year. This was also someone who wanted to be in New Orleans. He was not someone here who said, get me out, I don't want to play in this small market. He genuinely liked it here. This was not someone that caused any sort of off-court drama, off-season drama, anything like that. And look, he was a good, like the way you would describe him in a sense is a very, very good soldier here. You know, he arguably goes down as one of the best players in franchise history here. And you know, a lot of the issues that this team had wasn't his fault. Injuries to Zion Williamson is not his fault. You know, some of the bad luck that they've had with other injuries is not his fault. He certainly didn't do some of the front office moves that we've seen here that haven't worked out. But he also did himself no favors here in New Orleans, right? The fit with him and Zion Williamson, you know, for years has definitely been clunky here. You know, he did himself no favors by not shooting 3-pointers and kind of relying on that mid-range jumper a little bit more than he really should have. The injuries were a factor for him as well. This is someone who struggled to play through some of those injuries. He's been out since December 7th, right? That's not a great way to either build up your trade value or all of that. And in a weird sense, I think New Orleans in the front office liked him here and would have liked to have kept him. But as you've kind of seen a little bit, you know, with some of the trade stuff with Bradley Beal, even the Milwaukee Bucks and some of those other things here, you know, he became a victim in a sense of the new collective bargaining agreement rules. And that's not his fault necessarily. You know, it's just sometimes timing is everything and sometimes bad luck just happens. And that was definitely the case for Brandon Ingram. So I want to get into trading him here. Should they have done it earlier? Because I want you to consider something that I think is really, really important context around this. And this is something that the everydayers know I've been talking a lot about. The best time to ever trade a player is like as early on in their contract as you can. That's when their value's the highest, right? You sign a guy and his value's the highest it's going to be, and it's pretty much only going to go down based on that contract unless that player like dramatically improves over that time. But if that's not going to be the case, their trade value is the highest it's ever going to be at the early part of their contract here. So you could argue that the Pelicans would have gotten a much better return for Brandon Ingram last year or the year before that. Certainly not in the final year of his deal when he is an expiring contract. So you look at the return that he got, and this is the point I'm trying to make, and I really want you to consider this and let me know your thoughts on this in the chat right now, is Bruce Brown Jr., Kelly Olynyk, a decent enough first-round pick and a second-round pick. And if you look at the return for him as just that, I think you're missing some context around it. It's not just that, but it's also that playoff series against the Oklahoma City Thunder last year. I think that needs to be considered part of this trade as well. They could have moved Brandon Ingram last year. There was a real market for him. I'm not going to go into what some of those offers were, but last year it would have been significantly better than what they just got. But if they had done that, you don't get that playoff run last year. Through the play-in tournament, got swept by OKC in the first round. Not a great scenario with that, certainly, but did you enjoy it? Was that a fun season last year with 49 wins? They would not have had that at all without Brandon Ingram, even with the injuries that he had last year. So I look at this trade as being Bruce Brown, Kelly Olynyk, a first-round pick, a second-round pick, and a playoff series in a way that they hadn't gotten before. Did another trade just happen here? The Lakers are trading Dalton Knecht, Cam Reddish in 2020. Oh boy, for Mark Williams. That's a lot for Mark Williams, by the way, but that's interesting. We don't need to go into that here, but oh boy, it is late night here in the NBA. So I think the playoff series last year, and even that Suns series here, was something to kind of consider in this trade as well. They could have blown it up last season too, and you wouldn't have had that run. And then we wouldn't have been going into this season with a lot of optimism that we did admittedly have. And look, this year was not derailed by the front office or anything like that. They have issues there, certainly. But this season was derailed by the injuries to this team. To Brandon Ingram, to Zion Williamson, to Herb Jones, to CJ McCollum, to DeJounte Murray twice, Herb Jones twice as well, to Trey Murphy not being ready at the start of the year, right? Those are all things that kind of went into this season going off the rails. If they were in playoff contention right now, we might feel differently about it. And Brandon Ingram last year for that playoff run, I enjoyed it. I like going to playoff games, even if you get swept and things like that. That I do think is something that's worthwhile. Those were fun moments for me when it comes to that. That playoff run just to get in against the Phoenix Suns a number of years ago was really fun. And I think that's worth keeping in mind when you look at Brandon Ingram's tenure here, that yeah, honestly, if they wanted to do a proper rebuild here, and this is important keeping in mind, and I will do a full show about this later, was after the Anthony Davis trade, when they got Zion Williamson number 1 overall, you should have rerouted or traded Brandon Ingram, Lonzo Ball, and Josh Hart then, gotten them off the books, gotten tons of picks for them because their value would have been much higher back then, and done a slower rebuild around Zion Williamson. That would have been the move to do, but can you really do that? And I think that's worth keeping in mind when it comes to running a team, running a front office, right? It's one, that job is hard, but they made the playoffs last year, even if it wasn't a good series, and it was not. They looked terrible. Ingram looked terrible also too, and he was injured in that a little bit, but that kind of is a factor when it comes to all of this too. So I think there's some proper context needed around not trading Brandon Ingram early. I liked that playoff series last year, and you don't get that if you trade him during the season or before the season, whatever it might be. And that was something that they were looking at. So I think that's important context around that. So coming up next, I want to get into something that will also be a whole show. Look, it's a terrible season, and I never have a shortage of things to talk about, which is always interesting here. I want to look at the Daniel Theis trade and kind of what it says about the front office, and that actually ties into Brandon Ingram here. So that's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Super Bowl 59 is here, literally here in New Orleans. Anyone have tickets they want to give me, by the way? One game, 2 teams, endless possibilities, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, tails never fails. FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. Look, I don't have like a dog in the fight here, a horse in the race when it comes to this. I just want the game to be interesting, and it might not be. You can make it interesting with FanDuel. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. And knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, it's just icing on the king cake. So download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well, and become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans. Here we are, the #1 Pelicans podcast for a reason. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. For your second listen, go check out Locked On Saints, who's going to be the next Saints head coach. We might find out as soon as Monday. And Ross Jackson, who I'm having dinner with on Thursday night, along with a bunch of other Locked On hosts who are in town for the Super Bowl. It's going to be a lot of fun. Go make them your second listen today here. So let's keep talking NBA trade deadline. We went a lot into the Brandon Ingram deal, and I'm going to tie it into the Daniel Theis trade as well. It broke before this one that the Pelicans traded Daniel Theis and a second-round pick to the Oklahoma City Thunder for cash considerations. There's going to be more I'll do on the show. I know a lot of y'all were confused, like how you can just dump a player. There's ways to do it. The Pelicans found a way. OKC found a way. And basically, what they got in return was some cash. It'll probably be like $1 million, maybe less than that. Simple as that. They dumped Daniel Theis, deduct the luxury tax then. They wouldn't have been able to duck it with just this trade by itself. So basically what they did was, let's at least get under the luxury tax and we can figure everything else out later. I did not think that that trade was going to preclude another trade or moving on from Brandon Ingram. I will say this, on that Daniel Theis trade, I don't really think much of it. The pick that they traded, that second round pick, is actually owed in a pick swap to the Orlando Magic. They're going to get the worst of that pick no matter what. It's not a very good second round pick in the slightest. So it doesn't, to use that second round pick and duck the luxury tax in that deal doesn't bother me in a vacuum. What bothers me about that trade was you signed Daniel Theis at the beginning of the season because you didn't have the center position figured out. We didn't know about Misi just yet. And Misi right now is really struggling, not playing well. So that's worth keeping in mind. I don't know if Misi would have been a very good starter on a playoff team, even if this team was fully healthy and that was who was starting for you. I think that could have really, really hurt them. So to dump a guy that you signed because you didn't address other things isn't a great trade. You know, one of the things that the Pelicans have not done a good job of over the past couple of years is second round pick management. Those have become more valuable in subsequent years, and the Pelicans have been kind of just forced to give those up in salary dump moves, which I don't particularly like. You used 4 to undo the Devontae Graham mistake because he was messing up your salary cap after you traded a weird first round pick for Devontae Graham in a signing trade in the first place. So that type of situation is not great by the Pelicans. So their salary cap management, their second round pick management has been really bad. Now, the reason that they didn't have the center position figured out and thus needed to sign Daniel Theis and then needed to dump him later was because of how they handled Jonas Valanciunas. The day Jonas Valanciunas signed his extension here in New Orleans, I said they should trade him. That's now 3 years ago. I was saying they needed to trade him back then. They didn't. He ended up leaving basically for free. It was a second round pick they got in return for him. And they mismanaged that. They held on to him too long. Again, you don't get that playoff run last year without him. That's worth keeping in mind. But overall, that was not a good situation here. And the Pelicans do have a little bit of a habit of holding on to players too long and not kind of moving them when their value or when the timing is correct. Now, I just said in the last segment, like, I don't love this NBA that we live in of like, you've got to trade guys when their value is an all-time high. No, you do not. Sometimes it's worth to just keep those guys, let their value go down, but you win games. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. It is about winning games in the long run, not just getting value on trades, right? So sometimes you're going to need to hold on to a player, see their value go down because you want to win. That's what they did with Brandon Ingram. You could argue that that was the wrong move, but I think that playoff run last year kind of needs to be thought about with this trade as well as part of the return. But they need to stop doing that, like right now. You know, they fixed their books a little bit right now for next season where you can make another move. But depending on who you get in this draft, they do need to seriously consider blowing it up. They do need to seriously consider completely blowing up, trading Zion Williamson, trading CJ McCollum. I don't know if they'll do that yet. And that's kind of influenced by the DeJounte Murray injury. And he had successful surgery today. We wish him a speedy recovery, certainly. But they need to really try and kind of take a slightly different approach. It's not easy to do. It's not easy to do, certainly. But that's something that they really need to look at. The Daniel Theis move by itself in a vacuum, not a big deal to me. It's what led you to need to make that trade in the first place. And that's, you know, the symptom, the result of a couple of other mistakes that they have made. And that is not what you want to be doing when your salary cap is kind of fraught here. The Brandon Ingram one, I understand a little bit more, and I thought they got about as good of a return as you could get. Look, Toronto, for them, that's a bit of a steal. Even if he ends up walking, that's worth kicking the tires on and taking that risk for how little that return was with two guys that are not part of their future whatsoever, and a pick that you got a bunch of other picks in that Pascal Siakam deal. So there you go. Let me know what you think about the Brandon Ingram trade, about the Daniel Theis trade. We'll have more shows kind of on these larger topics, the kind of mismanagement of assets. Brandon Ingram's time here in New Orleans as well, and a whole bunch more because, yeah, it's never boring with this team, is it? Never boring with this team. We even talk about the game tonight. Trey Murphy played well. Zion Williamson played well. They lost, which is also good, right? Like, this is overall, I think, when you look at the other parts of the Brandon Ingram deal, a decent enough trade for New Orleans, about as good as you could get. And that's worth keeping in mind here, even if the return ultimately in terms of players and picks is not what you wanted. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to end the official part of the show right now. If you've been here with me for these live shows before, you know what we're going to do. I'm going to kind of say my outro here. I'm going to hit the little clip, and then we're going to come back in and do a little Locked On Pelicans After Dark, talk with y'all in the chat. So bring your questions. You've been talking a lot, so I'm not going to scroll back to try and find things. So start putting the questions in the chat right now. And as always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'll be back with you all tomorrow to break down more about the trade deadline and other things. Maybe there's another move that the Pelicans have that's coming up here in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Stay tuned for the Locked On Pelicans part after dark. All right, and we are back here talking all things Brandon Ingram trade. This is where I can interact with y'all in the channel as well. So if you have questions about this trade, things that weren't covered early on, put them in there. Just comments that you have as well. We're going to get into it again. From what I understand is the trade is Bruce Brown Jr., Kelly Olynyk, a 2026 first-round pick that's top 4 protected from the Indiana Pacers, and some second-round pick. I haven't seen what that is yet. I'm not trying to look at my phone. I don't have a ton of tabs open, so I easily might miss something here. So let's start to answer your questions. So a couple of things, first and foremost. Yeah, these guys could get rerouted. I don't think Bruce Brown Jr. will. I think they'll keep him. I'll let him expire. Olynyk, I think, could get rerouted. I don't think the Pelicans are looking to do that right away. I think they're going to be looking to keep him and move him in the offseason or next season. That's more likely than not here for that sort of trade. They also had the Daniel Theis trade earlier today. So that's kind of where we stand right now. So let's start with this. Colin Frazier says, how can the Lakers get Luka, but we can't get RJ Barrett? The Pelicans didn't want RJ Barrett. That is not what they wanted to do at all. Go listen to yesterday's show where I talk about why they weren't going to trade for RJ Barrett in this here. The Lakers don't need a center anymore after they just paid a fortune for what, Mark Williams from the Charlotte Hornets. So a question I'm seeing a bunch here is, what about CJ McCollum? Is he going to be on the move? I'm going to assume that he's not going to be on the move right now and that they're going to keep him going into the off season. I think right now, they don't know the direction of what next season is going to be. I think, if David Griffin is here, and who knows if he's going to be or not, they're going to try and compete next year, right? Like, that's what this team in theory is going to be doing, is let's be good. We'll add a top 5 pick, hopefully, and then we'll go into next season and be really good here and hopefully make the playoffs. CJ's a key part of that, right? Like, he is shooting the ball well. He had an incredible 3-point shooting season last year. They appreciate his professionalism. I think the plan right now, unless they get blown away by an offer, is to keep CJ McCollum and try and compete next season. So that's probably where they're going with this right now here. So a question I saw, this one I'll answer right now, is on Jordan Hawkins, who got hurt right at the end of the game. And it sounded like the x-rays came back negative with that. I see a couple people asking about Carlo. We're not going to get into the game tonight. We can get into Carlo and his play another day here, because the trade stuff's a little bit more important right now. I don't think Kelly Olynyk is going to take minutes for anyone. Look, you saw them playing Antonio Reeves. Now, there was no Jose Alvarado in this. You saw them start Carlo. I would assume they're going to continue to go with the youth movement here. And if they don't, we're going to rip them on the show, because that is what they should be doing right now. I don't think that there's any reason why they're going to let's see if we can make the playoffs, because they're not going to be able to make the playoffs whatsoever here. So you should still play with these young guys here. Someone says, why not trade Zion? Because if they want to make the playoffs next year, Zion's going to be your number one guy. And we see how special he is when he plays. He is very, very good. So there you go. That's why you don't trade him, because you don't have another guy to build around just yet. Realistically, you could get a franchise player in the draft if it's Cooper Flagg or one of those other guys. But there's also been plenty of times where guys picked in the top 4 don't pan out. It happens all the time. So while we think these guys are going to be great, I can tell you about 10, 15 players off the top of my head that were drafted in the top 5 that we thought were going to be good and then definitely didn't. So that's something to keep in mind, that if you're trying to make the playoffs next year, and there's no reason to think that the Pelicans aren't as of right now, then yeah, you don't trade Zion Williamson, because that's kind of what you do here. You've got to have kind of talent and all of those things. Mike Garcia says, Trey Murphy's play made it easier to trade BI. It's not only did it make it easier to trade BI, but with his extension kicking in next year, he goes from $5 million to $25 million next year. And that pushed BI out the door. It's not just that. Even if his play didn't justify it, they were still going to have to trade Brandon Ingram because of the salary cap for next year. You've got to also look a year in advance when it comes to trades and things like that. They had no need for RJ Barrett at $25 million. That would have put them over the luxury tax before you have to fill out 2 or 3 other roster spots. That's not something that they were going to do. These trades today, and I should have mentioned this in the full show, is clearing the way for them to sign Brandon Boston Jr. from a 2-way deal to a standard NBA contract as well. Something I can tell you they would like to do. So there's also that. That's kind of factored into this as well. This got them $200K more under the luxury tax. They were about $700,000 under the luxury tax after the Daniel Theis trade. This deal gets them a little bit more. I think they might be able to sign Brandon Boston Jr. tomorrow to a standard NBA deal should they want to. Or you can play the 10-day game for a couple of weeks and then sign Brandon Boston Jr. to that standard NBA contract and make him even cheaper. But they've avoided the luxury tax successfully here for this team. So there you go. Let's see. Detroit dumping CJ. I think they used up some salary cap space in a deal today, which means you can't really just dump him there. So I don't know if that's really going to be the case anymore. I don't think they're a team that is going to really be able to do that. So I don't actually think that the Pelicans are going to end up making another move. If there is, it's going to be a smaller thing. So I don't see anything, but you never know if teams start to get desperate. And look, the NBA is wild right now. Would we have thought Jimmy Butler on the Warriors, Luka Doncic in LA, some of these other trades that we've seen too are pretty crazy here. So you never know what's going to happen, but there you go. Someone asked me this one. If I were in charge of the team, what would I do? At this point, look, if y'all are an everydayer, if you've listened to me for a while, you know what I've long said, right? I would go down with the Zion ship. Like that, when he plays, right? You need that asterisk with it, or that, kind of qualifier, is such a special player that I think you've got to try and continue to build around him, even with a lot of the issues that he has, because the draft is a crapshoot. You can get Cooper Flagg. I don't think Cooper Flagg in the NBA is like a 25 point per game score, like at all. I don't think that's at all for him. I think he's a guy that's going to give you 18, 8 and 8 per game, which is still incredible. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's like he's going to be your number one scoring guy necessarily. He'll also give you incredible defense and hustle on every single player. So if you don't have that guy, where do you find him? What do you do? How do you get that number one scoring option, which is what you need? Zion Williamson, I do think, can be that type of guy here. So that's why I've long said I would go down with the Zion chip. That said, here's the qualifier on this, right? Is that with the DeJounte Murray injury, he's not going to be ready to start the year. If he's out the first 2 months of the season, what hole does that put you in? Are you able to tread water, and then are you able to figure it out? And one of the things is, if Willie Green's the head coach, I don't know if you will be able to. He has not shown the growth needed from this team or as a head coach. So I don't necessarily have faith for them to get over a bad start if your starting point guard isn't there for 2 months. And if you're not going to make the playoffs next year, there's no point in doing this whole routine dance again. So given that this offseason, I would seriously consider, depending on what your offers are for Zion Williamson, blowing it all up and starting fresh. That's what I would probably consider here. So I think that's kind of where something that they're going to evaluate, right? Like that's something that I think they are going to be dealing with and trying to figure out as the season goes on, or as the season goes on, as we get into the offseason. If you don't get anything for Zion Williamson, is it worth dumping him? Now, you could try and clear your books, and that's a smart way to do a rebuild. This is a whole show. Look at what OKC did. They had Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. They realized he could be the number one guy on a team. They cleared their books, and then they rented their cap space to get tons of draft assets, used some of those draft picks, have traded some other draft picks, and now are in a really good position. Part of the reason why you trade for all of those picks is in the hopes that like one or two work out, because they often don't. Every front office has draft misses. So if you can draft 4 guys and one of them works out, I don't know, that's pretty good at that point in time. So there you go. So I think that's an area where the Pelicans are going to really need to evaluate all this. I'm checking to see if there's any other news, and it does not look like there is. So that is good, because man, it is a night here as things have gone on. The whole NBA looks completely different right now, doesn't it? So keep your questions coming here in the chat. We can go for a little bit longer. I'm just going to say this. If you're going to be a jerk in the chat, I'm just going to completely ban you from the channel. I don't have time to delete messages or things like that. Like, put your questions in. Don't spam the chat. Come on. We're all just trying to talk Pelicans and have a good time over here and kind of make sense of the Brandon Ingram trade. If you want, continue to put your trade grades in the chat too. I think that's an important thing to consider here too, because I'm curious what y'all think. And I see it's a bit of a mixed reaction here. So let's touch on this, because this kind of goes back to evaluating the front office. And I see a lot of y'all saying they should fire David Griffin and all of that. Look, I think you could go either way on this. And I kind of go either way on all of this. So first and foremost, I do think it is, that's a good, Keith with a good comment here that I'm gonna touch on in a second after I make this point here. So that was a really, Keith put something out that I think is a really important thing to kind of look at here. So, when you look at the Daniel Theis trade, the Jonas Valanciunas stuff, and the position the Pelicans put themselves in with some of these things, it wasn't like they didn't try and address it. And one of the things that I've been stressing to y'all on the show this year is it's just hard running a front office and running an NBA franchise, right? Like, it's really tough running an NBA franchise here, and you might try and make moves and it doesn't pan out. They've tried multiple years in a row to trade for Miles Turner. They have tried multiple years in a row to trade for Jared Allen. They have absolutely tried. The problem is the other team's got to say yes. And the other teams haven't, for whatever the reason was. So when we look at this and go, hey, it's annoying and it's bad front office work that you have to use a second-round pick to duck the luxury tax, to dump a guy that you signed because you didn't address the center position early, so you had to go to the scrap heap and sign Daniel Theis, which is what happened here. It's not like they didn't try and upgrade it anywhere else and we're like, we're just not going to do anything about it. We'll sign Daniel Theis and that'll be that. They tried, right? They tried. And it just didn't work out. And you've at least, to use Willie Green's words, got to give the front office credit for trying. There are a lot of front offices that don't try. This team absolutely has tried. Now, they've failed when they've tried on a lot of that, but you got to try in the first place, right? And that is an important thing to look at here. So keep that in mind too when you're thinking about this front office. They've tried. You just got to get the other team's got to say yes. And at a certain point, value comes into all of this here. So I want to get back to something that Keith said here, and I think I just lost it. Let me find it. Keith says, if we dump CJ now, we can be active in the free agent market this summer. Not really. Not really. If you dump, I can even do the math here. I can break it out and see what salary cap space they would have. Let me pull up my Pelicans salary cap sheet here and see if we can do this. I almost want to share this on here and see if I can share my screen. So, okay, we are taking Oh, he's already off the books. Okay, so the only person that we're going to add to the salary cap for next year is Kelly Olynyk, right? That's all we're doing here. So let's put in Kelly on here, and he makes 13. What's that number here? Bear with me as I type this in. 13,445,122. 13,445,122. So if you are doing that right now, you are already over the soft cap by about 30 by, let's see, $24 million. You have $9 million to the luxury tax. That's what I said earlier. If you were to take CJ's contract out, here's how much cap space the Pelicans would have. I'm going to do the math for you. If you just dump CJ and don't get only expiring contracts in return. I don't know, my computer's being weird today, which is super annoying. Hold on. If you do that, I'm going to do this on my phone here. You don't have much salary cap space. So if moving CJ for just cap space to sign players, that's not what's going to happen here. You have $148,237,237 in salary. The soft cap is $154,600,123. You have $6 million in cap space. That's less than the mid-level exception that you would have next year to use. So you don't actually get cap space with that. Follow up on Keith's question is, Jake, you always say that players depreciate in value in contract years. Why are you changing your tune with CJ? That is a very good question. I have not once said they shouldn't trade CJ McCollum. I've been saying on literally every TV station here in the city for the past month, rather than moving Brandon Ingram, I would have moved CJ McCollum and try and signed Ingram to a team-friendly, like 2-year deal, something like that. Now, you might not want to run it back. That's totally valid. But that's what I would have been trying to do. That is not what the team is going to do, though. So when I talk about trades and things like that here, I'm trying to kind of inform you on what this team is going to do, why they're doing that, and giving you the proper context around it here. So that's kind of probably where they are. I think you could argue that CJ McCollum has more value here than he would anywhere else too. And I think that's also something that the front office realizes. If you can get 2 second-round picks for CJ McCollum, like sure, but if you want to try and make the playoffs next year, which they do, he's at that point maybe more valuable. So that's kind of the situation, I think, with CJ McCollum. Daniel Harris says, what would the team be looking for in the draft? I feel they're going to take best player available. If you're in the top 5, you're just taking best player available. Don't overthink it. It's a good draft. Just take the best player on your board and figure it all out later, because at this point you can kind of then retool your roster if you need to. Shout out to Josh Watson, who's watching from Melbourne, Australia. That's pretty awesome to see here. Love that we get the worldwide reach here at Locked On Pelicans. And going back to the free agent thing here, I see Spyro and says, who are good free agents this summer? I haven't even looked because, look, good big name players aren't going to be changing teams in free agency anymore. And if you also only have a little over $6 million in free agency to spend, like, you're not getting anyone good. It's better to operate as an over the cap team and get access to the $13 million non-taxpayer mid-level exception at that point. So that's where you're kind of looking at it with how they're going to probably, we got a ton of Australians here. That's where you're going to look at. Daniel Brown says, what about Kristaps Porzingis for CJ and some picks? You'd have to, no, like they're going to say no to that, right? Like they're going to absolutely say no to that. There's no way that the Boston Celtics are going to trade Kristaps Porzingis for CJ McCollum here, right? Like that's not what's going to happen at all. So you've got to factor that in when you think about some of these trades and things like that. They've tried to get Jared Allen, tried to get Miles Turner. Those teams said no, right? Like that's kind of how you've got to look at it here, right? So, yeah. George Alonso says, Jake, how are you not exhausted when it feels like we're constantly going through a rebuild? I mean, they made the playoffs last year. We thought they were going to be competitive this year. It doesn't feel like they're in a rebuild to me, truthfully. They made the play-in tournament the year before that. They made the playoffs the year before that, I think. I'm spacing on the timeline here. Like, they have been trying to be competitive and they have won games. So I don't think they're necessarily like constantly in a rebuild. The fact that they're not in a rebuild, the fact that they never entered a rebuild during the Zion Williamson era, I actually think is maybe part of the problem. The fact that they haven't been in a full-blown rebuild where you're kind of approaching things like an Oklahoma City Thunder did and what have you. And I think that could arguably be part of the problem here when it comes to it for this team. So keep that in mind as well, that it might feel like the wheels are always being spun, and I agree with you on that. But look at some of these teams that have kind of like bottomed out and don't get out of it. And I think that's worth keeping in mind too. When are the Washington Wizards going to get out of whatever hell that they're going to be in for an extended period of time, right? It doesn't look like any time soon, in my opinion. That's not fun. They're on their second head coach right now. After a run of a couple years of back-to-back playoff appearances and things like that, they went through, starting a rebuild, and they have not gotten out of it at any point, and it's only going to get worse for him before it gets better. They're going to be on a 4-year playoff drought. That looks like it'll be 7-8 for them probably before they get into the playoffs again. You're all frustrated now, and look, I'm frustrated too, and I completely get it, right? But how are you going to feel if they don't make the playoffs for 8 years? Because it's tough. You're going to miss on draft picks. There's going to be other things like that you've got to go through too. That's not a fun situation to be in. We'll still be covering it here. I've covered this team for 15 years. I've seen worse than this. I've seen more boring basketball than this season and other seasons too, even if this year is definitely very, very unfun when it comes to it. George Alonso says Willie is almost guaranteed to get fired by the end of the season. I would imagine so. If they bring him back, I think that's a very big mistake. I think Willie's been dealt a bad hand with a lot of the injuries. Those are not his fault whatsoever, but you also have not seen the growth from him. So I think they do need to move on from him. JR265 says, any chance we bring back Elfrid Payton until DeJounte Murray comes back next year? I think they might look to do it. Maybe they sign him to a 10-day or something like that, but I think it was a nice story. It would be cool to see him again, especially being local, but I don't think his time in the NBA is probably more done than not. Ethan Holloway says, you're worried at all about Zion wanting to leave New Orleans for a bigger market? I mean, not really. So one, I do think he likes it here. I think he actually has a pretty good relationship with the team now, and I think he wants to be here and is fine being here. But also put it this way, if he wants to request out, okay. I don't know, a shrug and just be like, all right, man, let's get a return. And that's going to be that. And it just sends the Pelicans in a different direction. Simple as that, right? If people are complaining, they're like, we want to blow it up. We want to trade Zion. Cool. If he requests out, that's what you do, but he hasn't. And I think that's worth keeping in mind too. He could. So there you go. So it looks like it's a 2031 second round pick. Is that correct? Is that what they're getting? John, are you worried that Trey Murphy would want to leave? I mean, he's got a new extension that's kicking in that's 4 years. Even if he wants to, he's not going anywhere and they're not going to trade him. So I don't think even if he wants to, you're not worried about that at this point because of the team control here. You don't really want to keep players that don't want to play for you. But at the same point, I do think it's sometimes worth just being hi, you're under contract, deal with it. And that's probably what they would do for Trey Murphy. And those players are going to play, and it's not going to end up in a very negative situation. And then even if Trey was like, you better trade me, and it becomes this messy thing, you're going to get a ton in return for Trey Murphy. So if you want to rebuild there, cool. You can completely start fresh. So, that kind of, I don't know, those things kind of answer themselves in my opinion. So I'm just not I don't know how to describe it other than those things don't stress me out. If Zion wants to leave, I've been saying maybe they should blow it up fully. I've also been saying I see why they want to keep building around him and try and win next year. And I'm fine with either direction, truthfully. So there you go. Mr. CJ Lance, Raptors fan in the chat, is Brandon Ingram good? What are your unbiased thoughts? My man, you get a lot of opinions here when it comes to that. We'll have more on that. I have a feeling Sean Woodley, host of Locked On Raptors, is going to reach out, and I'll probably be on his show in the next day or so when it comes to all of that here. So there you go. David C says, we all know Zion wants to leave. Zion drooled over the idea of the Knicks before. No, he drooled over the idea of Madison Square Garden, which literally every player wants to go play in. I've never watched a game there, and I would drool over the idea of watching a game in Madison Square Garden because it generally seems like a very cool place and atmosphere and all of that. So there you go. So, all right, we've gone almost an hour here. If y'all want to tell Mr. Lance here what the thoughts are from Brandon Ingram, do it quickly because I'm going to answer one or two more questions and then we are going to start to wrap up everything here. Stranger says, I went to the Raptors. Yes, he did. For those who haven't heard here, I think. So we'll see what the Raptors end up doing with his contract, right? Like that's the bigger question when it comes to that. So I don't know what's going to end up happening there, but that's on them to try and figure out. But look, end of an era here in New Orleans, like certainly end of an era when it comes to Brandon Ingram's tenure. It deserves a lot of love from Pelicans fans, from the organization as well, even if it just didn't ultimately work out into what we would have hoped that it would be. So there you go. Keep commenting on Locked On Pelicans. Keep listening to Locked On Pelicans. There's a ton of y'all in here watching right now, and I appreciate y'all staying up late with me. It's almost midnight. I need to go to sleep and edit the show. So as always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. And I'll be back with y'all tomorrow to make more sense of the trade that we just saw. See y'all next time.